This is Amelia from Amelia Voice, and today I'll tell you a story that will make your heart ache and your soul burn for justice. A story that begins with satin and promises and ends with a video so devastating it made a queen of manipulation fall to her knees. I still remember the way she smiled when she first met me, that crisp, approving smile that never reached her eyes, because even as she leaned in to kiss my cheek and called me family, there was a pinch at the corner of her mouth that said she was testing me. Measuring me, cataloging my softness and my edges, summing me up like a problem she intended to solve. Her name was Victoria, my future mother-in-law, and my fiancé Daniel, sweet, earnest, jaw set when he cares Daniel, was blind to the little flinches I tried to hide every time his mother's tone clipped the air like scissors. I told myself to be patient, to be kind, to respect the woman who raised the man I loved, and maybe I should have trusted my instincts instead. Because the first time Victoria walked into the bridal boutique and saw the dress, my $5,000 miracle of hand-stitched pearls and whisper-thin lace, she laughed under her breath, the sound delicate and poisonous, and said, "Bold choice," the way someone might say, avoidable mistake. And I told myself she was nervous too. I told myself she didn't mean anything by it. But the seamstress, whose fingers trembled over the fabric like a pianist over a beloved piano, caught my eye, and I saw it there. She'd heard that laugh before. We all had. It was the laugh of a woman who always got her way. In the beginning, there were small cuts, nothing you'd call a wound until you bled. Victoria accidentally switched the tasting cake flavors so I couldn't sample the one I'd chosen. She forgot to pass along messages from the florist. She invited her friends to our venue walkthrough without asking me, as if I were a guest at my own wedding, and Daniel kept saying, "She's trying." And maybe that was true in her language. Maybe for her trying meant reshaping the world with gentle cruelty until it looked like her reflection. I tried to breathe through it, to make room for her in our life. But make enough room for a hurricane and it will empty the house. Still, there were moments Daniel and I would sidestep to the kitchen at night, his palm warm on my hip, and I'd say, "Please don't let her plan the seating chart." And he'd kiss my forehead and promise, "I won't." And I believed him because what is an engagement if not a series of promises you believe with your whole heart? On the day the dress arrived from its final fitting, I laid it out in our spare room, and the afternoon light turned the lace into frost and sugar, the pearls into tiny moons, and I pressed my cheek to the bodice and whispered the future I could see in its stitches. The vows, the dance, the laughter that climbs and climbs until it tilts into tears, the kind that tastes like salt and joy. Later that night, Victoria called and said she wanted to bring me a little something blue. Her voice honeyed. A sweet coat over steel, and I thought, let her. Maybe this is the soft turn. Maybe this is the patching of our seams. Maybe we can both choose to love the same man without tearing each other apart. When she arrived, she stood in the doorway looking elegant in her cream coat and silk scarf, and she glanced past me toward the spare room and said, so casually it should have been harmless, "May I?" And I nodded because even then, I was still trying to be worthy of the family I was marrying into. She excused herself to the bathroom first, her clutch purse clamped under her arm like a secret, and I poured tea, tried to slow my heartbeat, tried to look calm so she wouldn't smell the fear and mistake it for permission. When she emerged, her lipstick was a precise, perfect line, and she handed me a tiny velvet box with a sapphire pin inside. And for a flicker of a second, I saw the girl she must have once been, hoping someone would call her generous, thoughtful, irreplaceable. "It was my grandmother's," she said, and the words tripped my heart, a piece of the past offered forward, a thread connecting women who had survived storms. I thanked her, and we walked into the spare room together, and the light reached for the dress again, and she stood very still. "It's a lot," she murmured, but she smoothed the lace. A reverent touch, almost tender. And if you had been there, you might have believed that peace hung in the air like a fragile ornament you were afraid to exhale near. We talked about the ceremony reading, and the flowers, and the music. And she told me she was happy for Daniel truly, and I let my guard down like an exhausted soldier. Because that is the danger of being kind, isn't it? You want to believe in the soft landing. You want to believe the person who has wounded you is suddenly healing. She left before Daniel returned from work. And I kissed him hello, and we made pasta with too much garlic. And we laughed about registry arguments, and I didn't mention the way my skin prickled after she'd gone. Because suspicion feels ugly in your mouth, and I was tired of ugliness. Hours later, I went to the spare room to pin the sapphire on the hanger, and I stopped in the doorway because the air had a smell, faint and chemical, like a salon after a bad idea, and my chest tightened. I stepped closer, my fingertips grazing the lace, and the section that had been pure white now had a run of off-color streaks, barely visible if you didn't know what you were seeing, like invisible ink waiting for fire. My voice came out small. Daniel, and he was there. And he said it must be the light, the shadows, the time of night. But the next morning, the truth screaming in daylight, the delicate webbing along the hem had been contaminated with something that ate at the fibers, turning strong threads brittle, turning texture into ash. The seamstress's voice went hoarse on the phone. It's like bleach, love. A diluted solvent. Someone did this. And my throat went cold because the only person who had been alone with my dress was the woman who had just called me family. I wanted to be wrong. I prayed I was wrong. But grief is precise when it chooses you. And as I sank onto the floor back against the wall, looking at a ruin so pretty you might miss it, a new promise stitched itself into my bones, the kind you don't say out loud because the saying makes it real. I will not be the girl who takes this quietly. I will not be the bride who bows. I wiped my eyes, I stood up, and I did something I had never done before with Victoria. I stopped being generous, and instead I started paying attention. Daniel wanted to fix it. Which was the most Daniel thing of all, a man who believes in straight lines in a world made of spirals. He said we could rush order another panel. The seamstress could patch the lace, nobody would notice. And I stared at him because the point wasn't fabric. It was vandalism of a promise. The theft of a moment I had bought with months of worry and saving and sitting on my hands every time I passed a window with shoes I loved. And he kept saying, we'll fix it, like repairs could vacuum grief out of a room. Like a bandage could change the fact that someone had chosen to wound me. It's not an accident, I said, and his jaw tensed in that way that means he is arguing with himself. And he murmured the word proof as if that would make the truth more palatable. As if a confession signed in blood is the only language anyone should trust. So I held my tongue because the fight I wanted to have was not with him. Not with the boy who still hopes kindness can reason with a hurricane. And instead, I began to move like a woman laying out chess pieces for a game she never wanted to play. Because if Victoria was going to write me as hysterical in her story, I would annotate every line with facts. I went to the seamstress and asked for scraps. Lace that matched the pattern. Tulle like sugar, a few pearls tucked into an envelope. And at home, I arrayed them like evidence bags and bought 3 bottles, stain remover, diluted bleach, the beloved safe fabric brightener influencers coo about. And I tested each on a swatch, photographing the way the threads winced and withered, marking edges in pencil like a map of tiny disasters. And when the brightener bloomed, the same sickly veins I'd seen crawling up my hem, I felt that cold clarity that sits on your shoulder when you learn the monster has a polite name. I started a notebook. Page 1, dates and times. Page 2, Victoria's tells, how my choice made her nostrils flare. How let me help was code for let me control. How she always asked to be alone for something. That sounded small enough to be harmless. And page 3, places to hide my phone where the microphone would sip the room without being seen. Then I went to a thrift store and bought a stand-in dress. Not precious, but close enough in cut to scratch at her curiosity, because sometimes you have to build a stage before someone shows you their favorite mask. And that night I told Daniel I needed 48 hours of space. Not because I wanted distance from him, but because togetherness sometimes requires oxygen. And when the apartment was mine, I set it up with the calm of borrowed weather. Mannequin in the spare room. Phone tilted on the bookshelf behind a row of paperbacks, red recording light tucked under the shadow of a dust jacket, window cracked to pull in the soft hiss of the hallway, so a sudden silence wouldn't sound like a trap. And when I texted Victoria to say I was too upset to think straight, and maybe you could take another look and tell me if I'm overreacting, I could feel the hook leaving my fingers and the faint tug on the line. She came in under an hour because of course she did. perfume first like a warning, and when I told her Daniel was out, there was a quick flicker across her face. Relief? The easy kind of cruelty that performs better without an audience. And I walked her down the hall. Tea she wouldn't drink cooling on the counter, and I said, "Could you look at the hem with me?" letting my voice tremble like a curtain in a draft, and she went in ahead, circling the mannequin the way a shark circles a floating thing that used to be alive, saying, "Oh dear," too lightly, as if ruin were a smudge, and I said the seamstress thought it looked like brightener. Did she know anything about that? And she blinked one beat too long and produced a tissue like a magician producing innocence. And she lectured me about boutiques and panic, and how her alterations lady didn't make a living by scaring brides. And I stepped closer and mentioned cameras, at the boutique, in the building, in the hall. And I watched the pleasure slip right off her face, the little secret savoring she couldn't keep completely buried. And I asked her straight, "Were you alone with the dress when you visited?" And she chose a soft-baked confession, the kind that expects gratitude. Yes, she touched it, she tried to help. She dabbed a little brightener on a spot she thought was a shadow. She didn't tell me because I'm sensitive, and there it was. Guilt wrapped like a gift, a weapon disguised as care. And I nodded instead of screaming because I had the only witness I needed tucked between a battered paperback and a candle that smelled like rain. And when she said, "The important thing is not to make a scene," I almost laughed because that sentence was a thesis statement she had written under every moment of my life since I met her. And after she left, satisfied that she had taught the child not to wail, I closed the curtains and pressed play and listened to my own living room become a courtroom where the defendant read her own verdict out loud. Daniel texted, "Can I come home?" And I said yes, and when he walked in I didn't waste breath on a preamble. I just put the phone in his hand and watched the exact moment his heart broke into two truths: the mother he'd spent a lifetime protecting, and the fiancé who had spent a lifetime learning to swallow, and his face drained and then flushed, and then set into a shape I had never seen. Disappointment poured into iron, and he whispered, "She said she tried to help," like a question altar boys ask in empty churches. And I said, "She knew what she was doing so quietly it sounded like prayer, and he didn't defend her this time. He just sat and held the phone the way men hold tools they don't want to learn to use, and said he would talk to her. And I said I would talk to her, but not alone, because I was done being outnumbered by a smile. And I didn't know what the next step would be until fate mailed it to us in cream cardstock edged in gold. An invitation to Victoria's engagement. Party to Charles Whitmore, a financier with a perfect cufflink smile and a reputation for polishing tarnish until people forget it was there. And as I turned the heavy paper over in my hands, I understood the shape of the room I needed. A ballroom full of her believers, a stage she worshipped, a place where performance is oxygen and a single spark can take it all away. I RSVP'd yes, booked a simple white dress I wouldn't mind losing, charged every battery I owned, set auto-uploads to a cloud no one in her kingdom could touch, and practiced keeping my voice steady enough to cut glass. Because revenge, I was learning, isn't chaos, it's choreography. And if you want the music to obey you, you count every beat before you begin. The night of the engagement party felt like stepping into a painting where the colors were too rich to trust, where the gold leaf on the walls had the shine of teeth and the chandeliers shook with laughter no one meant. Everyone wore outfits heavy with approval, the kind of fabrics that say we know where the money hides. And as I walked in on Daniel's arm, my simple white dress a rebuke to the velvet and jewels, I felt the hum of electricity under my skin. Not fear, not exactly. More like the steady buzz of a storm watching the village it plans to visit. Victoria saw us the way a hawk sees a mouse pretending to be a stone, her eyes calm, precise, gleaming with the private knowledge that no one tells a queen where she may not stand. And she glided to us with a smile that had been practiced in mirrors more expensive than my car. And she kissed Daniel's cheek and pressed cool fingers to my forearm as if to check my pulse for signs of disobedience. "I'm glad you came," she said. And I answered, "I'm glad we were invited," and felt her tiny flinch at the edge of my politeness, like I'd stepped on her hem. Charles arrived in a sweep of applause. Tall, polished, the exact kind of man who can turn a rumor into a charity gala. And when he took Victoria's hand and lifted it for a kiss, I watched for the tremor and saw only confidence. That careful masculine ease you get when a woman has curated your life to be frictionless. The ballroom breathed around us, strings of conversation plucked tight, crystal singing against crystal, photographers catching triumph and archiving it for when kindness is required later. And I began my count. Not to 10, but to the moments. Check the upload settings. Feel the phone in the inner pocket. Look for the exits. Watch for the corners where people forget they are being watched. I took Daniel to the far balcony, the marble cool against our backs, and told him the plan very softly, the way you describe a bomb you are holding. Tonight was not about scenes. It was about a single clean line, the truth delivered to exactly the person who needed to hear it. No theatrics, no shouting, a surgical cut through the silk. He nodded, said he trusted me, and I believed him the way you believe a bridge because you have to cross it. Inside, toasts began, dappled praise like water from a fountain, and every compliment for Victoria had its own shadow. The audience turning their faces to the light and not to the gravity of the woman whose orbit they admired. I moved through the crowd like a rumor, smiling, greeting, collecting small observations, how her friends smiled too hard, how the planner deferred like a violinist defers to the first chair, how Charles's sister watched me with a curiosity that felt like worry, and then, because fate is both lazy and cruel, the thing that should not have happened did. Victoria followed me to the powder room and locked the door behind us, her perfume blooming in the small mirrored space like a lie made of flowers. "I hope we're done with drama," she said to our reflections, and my breath fogged the glass where my courage had etched itself. And I told her I had no interest in drama, only in truth. And if we were honest, we both knew what she had done. Something flashed across her face, a dart of cruelty and calculation, and she stepped closer, her voice dropping into the register she uses for men she thinks she can manage. And she called me fragile, called me ungrateful, called me a girl who didn't understand the cost of appearances. And there it was again, the exact thesis of her life. Appearance as God, reality as servant. I asked her why, and she said the quiet part out loud. "Because you weren't right for him and you refused to be corrected." And then she smiled. That terrible tender smile she uses to flavor poison, and admitted what my camera had already caught. Not the soft-baked version this time, but the decadent truth, that she saw the dress as a test, that she chose the brightener because it ruins slowly, gives you hope and then takes it, a message she thought I'd understand about who gets to write the story. The sink hummed. The mirror multiplied us into a chorus of women who'd been told to be small, and I let her speak because this voice, this pure uncut spite, was the rarest evidence of all. And when she reached out to fix a strand of my hair, the gesture intimate as strangling, I stepped back and said very clearly that I was done, that I hoped she would enjoy her party, that I would enjoy my life. And I unlocked the door and left her there holding the air. Back at the table, Daniel's hand shook when I told him, not with fear, but with the knowledge of a line crossed so cleanly the blood hadn't realized it yet. And he asked me if I wanted him to confront her, and I said no, because the confrontation I wanted could not be spun into hysteria and dismissed. I watched the room revolve around its center, watched Victoria recover, watched her work the chandeliers, full wattage, and I thought of all the girls who had gone home from nights like this, with their throats burning and their eyes dry, because crying would ruin the mascara their mothers told them to protect. And I reached into my dress and felt the rectangle of salvation sitting there waiting like a small, obedient animal. Charles was making a toast, polished and affectionate, about late love and second chances, and when he lowered the glass, I stepped near enough to see the pores in his skin, the faint engraving on his cufflinks, and I said, "I have a clip you should see later. It's about alterations. You're meticulous, you'll understand." And his smile didn't slip, but his eyes did, a millimeter of suspicion filing a note for tomorrow. "Send it," he said, easy, generous, like a man who can afford to be gracious. And I said, "Of course," and felt a relief so sharp it almost knocked me down. But the party wasn't done being dangerous. Victoria saw us, of course she did, and she carved her way through the guests to stand between us. All charm, all pearls, acting like the ocean hadn't dragged a city under, and she cooed something about surprises and how she had a slideshow to play later. And if there is a god of irony, he was surely drunk that night. I smiled and said I loved surprises too. And Charles excused himself for a call. And in that pause, I saw the path open in front of me. Clean, clear, paved in polished stone. Wait for the moment between applause and music. A single second of perfect silence and then press send. The playlist swelled. Waiters poured champagne like comet tails. And I stood at the edge of the dance floor building a cathedral out of nerve, brick by trembling brick, even as doubt tried to pull me outside by the wrist. What if he doesn't believe you? What if she spins faster than you can catch? What if your life becomes a cautionary tale told in hushed voices over chiffon? I squeezed Daniel's hand, he squeezed back, and in that exchange we stitched a new vow, one that doesn't require an aisle to be binding. We will not abandon each other to someone else's narrative. The clock in my chest struck the hour. The song dipped into lace, and I pulled the phone free and opened the message thread I had started with Charles, while the moon pretended not to watch through the windows. I selected the file, thumb hovering like a diver at the end of a board over dark water, knowing the fall isn't where you die, it's the ground, knowing also that sometimes the plunge is the point. I closed my eyes for a heartbeat to trap the tremor, opened them to the room she thought she owned, and set my finger down. The message sent with a soft whoosh that felt louder than the band. And for a heartbeat, the party carried on in ignorant glitter, the chandeliers gossiping in crystal and the laughter rising like bubbles in a glass. But then I watched across the room as Charles glanced down, thumbed open the video, and the world's axis shifted a fraction. He did not react right away, because men like Charles are trained to keep their faces smooth while the floor turns to water. But his posture gave him away. He went very still, the kind of stillness that happens right before a building collapses. And then his eyes slid up from the tiny screen to find Victoria, the woman he'd chosen to be his sequel. And he stared at her like a man seeing a painting under different light for the first time and realizing the masterpiece is mostly varnish. He watched the whole thing. Her voice in my hallway, the powder room confession, the syrupy condescension poured over the acid of intent. And when the clip ended, he did not look at me, and he did not look at Daniel. He stepped forward into the party wearing shock like a tailored coat and raised his hand to the band in a gesture that made the violins hush like scolded children. Conversations fell off the edge of sentences, champagne froze mid-air, and the room presented its throat to silence. "Victoria," he said, not cruelly, not kindly, just correctly. "A moment." And he walked to the center of the floor as if he were walking to an altar, and the crowd remodeled itself into an audience. I could have sent the video privately, could have let the truth do quiet domestic work, but she is an architect of rooms where women are expected to swallow their own tongues. And so I stood where I was, not hiding, not bragging, simply there. And when she reached him, she took his elbow and smiled for the photographers. That smile calibrated to outshine the sun, and he didn't return it, which is when I knew the bridge was ash. He held up his phone, and in a voice that could have announced a donation, read the first sentence he'd heard her say to me that night. "Because you weren't right for him and you refused to be corrected." And a ripple went through the guests like wind through wheat. And someone laughed the wrong sort of laugh and swallowed it like a cherry pit. And Victoria moved to speak, but Charles lifted a single finger, impeccably polite, and pressed play. Her voice filled the ballroom, honey and knives, confession braided with contempt. And you could watch people recalibrate in real time, all those years of curated myth shrinking like silk in hot water. She reached for the phone and he stepped back as if she were reaching for a weapon. And for once the camera lights didn't love her, they showed the seams. Daniel was beside me, his jaw a locked door, and I felt his heart beating at my shoulder like an animal. And when his mother said his name, "Daniel, darling, tell them I was helping," he didn't step in, didn't throw a coat over the bleeding truth to keep her warm. The bandleader coughed, the planner hovered. A murmur rose, words like bleach, ruined, cruel, and then Charles, refined even in disappointment, said simply, "We won't be proceeding." and handed her the ring box the way you hand a sharp object back to the person who brought it. And there it was, the one thing she couldn't orchestrate: consequences in public. Not because I screamed, but because she did. She turned on me then, of course, her face a mask slipping its elastic. And for a second I saw the child inside the queen, the little mouth forming around the word mine, and I felt a tenderness I did not expect, followed by a mercy I knew I could not afford. She took one step, then two, a speech unsheathing in her throat, the kind that would turn me into the villain of a story she'd tell in whispers for years. But I didn't give her that gift, I said softly, so only the nearest tables could hear. You taught me not to make a scene, and watched the meaning land, watched it bruise. The crowd did the math and balanced the ledger in the oldest currency: attention. People who had never looked away from her couldn't quite meet her eyes. Her friends, the ones who wore smiles like brooches, fastened them tighter and turned their faces to the exits. Charles's sister, the one with the worried curiosity, stepped near me and exhaled in relief you could have bottled. Victoria tried to turn, tried to recover, tried to alchemize fact into misunderstanding, but the video did not care about her gifts. It sat there like a stone in the throat of the night. Security wasn't needed. Humiliation did the ushering, and she left on her own, coat clutched around her like a sail in sudden wind, photographers unsure if compassion or appetite should guide their hands. The party stumbled on in a feverish decrescendo, the way a storm pretends to apologize to the fields it has already flattened. And Daniel, my Daniel, finally exhaled a breath I think he'd been holding since childhood. Later, much later, when the cars were gone and the staff were sweeping up the last glitter, he and I sat on the edge of the empty dance floor and he said he was sorry. Not for being her son, but for letting her write the captions under my life. And I told him I loved him like a promise I intended to keep. And he said he wanted to build a family with me that did not require anyone to shrink. The days after were quieter, which is the strange thing about justice. It's not loud once it arrives. It just sits there, rearranging the furniture. Victoria tried to call, left voicemails where she performed the part of misunderstood matriarch, asked for forgiveness without apologies, and we did not answer. The boutique seamstress treated the dress like a patient she refused to lose, and while the damage could not be reversed, she stitched a secret along the hem. A line of blue thread in tiny hearts like a string of breaths. And when I saw it, I cried for the first time without shame. Cried for the girl who had wanted to be loved enough to be spared. Cried for the woman who now knew love that doesn't protect you isn't love at all. We were married 2 months later in a garden where the wind christened us and the sun learned our names. And I wore the repaired dress with its faint scars like a map of the territory I had crossed. And Daniel's hands shook at the vows, but his voice did not. And when it came time for toasts, there were no slideshows. Just people who loved us enough to tell the truth. We never sent Victoria an invitation, which felt brutal until I remembered she'd RSVP'd no to my dignity months ago. And afterward, when the music softened and the stars did their ancient blinking, I took Daniel's face in my hands and thanked him for choosing me. Not over her, but with me, and he said he was proud I'd chosen myself. As for Charles, a card arrived addressed in a careful hand. Thank you for the clarity. I wish you both peace. It was the kindest thing a stranger had ever sent me. What I learned is that revenge, when it is real, is not about spectacle. It's about restoration, of your voice, of your boundaries, of the parts of you that were quietly stolen and then returned with a receipt. And yes, I sent the video, yes. It shattered something she thought unbreakable. But the real payback was waking up the next morning and realizing that the story I was in belonged to me again. This is the truth I want you to keep like a talisman in your pocket. You do not owe anyone your silence to be loved. And if someone demands it, send them the sound of your life choosing itself, even if that sound is as small as a clip traveling through the air toward a phone that never expected to meet justice on a dance floor glittering with everyone's good intentions.